A captivating story of redemption, love, passion, and new beginnings. He dismissed her at first glance, but when he saw her in all her splendor, it was too late to undo his judgment. Now, caught between desire, guilt, and a dangerous secret, he must choose: save her, or lose her forever. The mist descended over Pine Ridge, as it always did on March mornings, enveloping the town in a melancholy that seemed to have permanently settled among its narrow streets and colonial buildings. David Mitchell adjusted the rearview mirror of his black Volvo as he climbed the steep road leading to St. Thomas Hospital, watching as the fog swallowed the familiar contours of the town he had chosen to rebuild his life in after the tragedy. 3 years. 3 years since he had left Chicago and his meteoric career as a cardiovascular surgeon at Northwestern Memorial to bury himself in this Colorado mountain town where nobody asked questions about the past, where people treated him with the reverence reserved for competent doctors, but maintained a respectful distance that he cultivated with care. In Pine Ridge, David Mitchell was simply the doctor who saved lives and didn't engage in small talk. The hospital parking lot was busier than usual for a Monday. David frowned when he noticed the official cars from the Department of Health parked near the main entrance. He vaguely remembered a memo about reinforcements in the palliative care department, but had dismissed any attention to the matter. His surgical wing functioned perfectly, and he preferred to remain isolated from administrative changes that didn't directly affect him. He crossed the lobby with firm steps, greeting the employees he encountered with discreet nods. Nurses whispered, "Good morning, doctor," with contained smiles. Technicians respectfully moved out of his way, and even other doctors seemed to measure their words in his presence. It wasn't arrogance, David knew that. It was the aura he had meticulously built around himself over the past few years, that of a brilliant professional, but emotionally inaccessible. In the elevator rising to the 6th floor, where his private office was located within the hospital, David closed his eyes and allowed himself a few seconds of the morning ritual he had developed. He breathed deeply, mentally organized the day's procedures, and pushed any thoughts unrelated to work to the darkest corners of his mind, especially thoughts about Claire. Claire, who would have turned 42 last week. Claire, whose perfume still seemed to permeate the closet in the house where he lived alone. Claire, who had died on an icy December road because he had been too proud to stop her when she grabbed the car keys after their fight. The office was impeccable, as always. David had hired a cleaning company from Denver that came 3 times a week to keep everything exactly as he liked it. Dust-free surfaces, papers organized in symmetrical stacks, pens aligned on the dark mahogany desk. Absolute order in the work environment, since order in his personal life had become impossible to maintain. The first appointment of the day was with Mrs. Anderson, a 73-year-old woman he had been following for 2 years due to controlled heart failure. She always arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled time, always brought a thermos with hot coffee, and always tried to make conversation about his personal life. She was one of the few patients that David genuinely appreciated, mainly because her gentle persistence in humanizing the consultations forced him to exercise emotional muscles that he was always trying to atrophy. "Doctor Mitchell, you look tired today," said Mrs. Anderson, as soon as she settled into the armchair in front of his desk. "Haven't you been sleeping well?" David smiled, a professional smile, but not devoid of genuine affection. "You've always been very observant, Mrs. Anderson. Let's see how that heart of yours is doing, which is what really matters here." While examining the patient, adjusting her medication, and explaining the necessary care, David was able to function on the autopilot he had perfected over the years. His hands moved with precision. His words were carefully chosen to reassure without giving false hope, and his mind remained focused exclusively on the clinical present. It was in this state of absolute concentration that he felt closest to something he could call peace. The morning hours passed in a predictable succession of consultations, examinations, and minor procedures. It was only during lunch, when he went down to the hospital cafeteria, that David realized something was different in the environment. Whispered conversations among groups of nurses, curious glances directed at a table in the corner of the room, and a general atmosphere of novelty that didn't go unnoticed by someone accustomed to reading the subtleties of human behavior. David picked up his tray, always the same thing: green salad, grilled chicken breast, brown rice, and orange juice, and looked for an isolated table where he could eat in peace while reviewing the afternoon patient's files. That's when he saw her for the first time. Sitting alone at a table near the window, a woman in her early 30s ate in silence while reading a book propped against a glass of water. Brown hair tied in a low bun, apparently without any product to give it shine or movement. Impeccable, but shapeless white lab coat that completely hid the shape of her body. No visible makeup, not even a discreet lipstick. No jewelry except for a simple silver watch on her left wrist. David automatically categorized her. New nurse, probably one of the transfers from the Department of Health, with no apparent vanity or interest in making an impression. The type of professional who clocked in, did the work and left without leaving traces in the hospital's social dynamics. In other words, someone he could completely ignore. He finished lunch without paying any more attention to the woman and returned to his afternoon appointments. It was only when he was in the 5th-floor hallway on his way to a post-operative patient's room that he saw her again. This time she was crouched beside the bed of Mr. Johnson, an 80-year-old man who had been hospitalized for a week with complications from a heart attack. "You don't need to be afraid to tell me," the woman was saying, holding the patient's hand with a naturalness that caught David's attention. "Sometimes when we wake up at night and there's no one around, the thoughts get very heavy, don't they?" Mr. Johnson, who had been standoffish and ill-tempered with the entire medical team since his admission, seemed almost childlike talking to her. "It's just that I think about my Martha, you know, nurse. She died 5 years ago, but at night I forget and keep waiting for her to come home." The woman didn't respond immediately. She just kept holding the man's hand, letting the silence work in favor of the confession he needed to make. There was something profoundly human in that gesture, a presence that went far beyond technical competence. "You know what I think," she finally said, and her voice had a particular quality, a softness that seemed to draw the words in the air. "I think she is coming home. It's just that now home is here inside your chest, and she arrives whenever you remember her with affection." David stopped in the hallway, pretending to consult the medical chart, but actually observing that interaction with growing curiosity. There was something in the way the nurse conducted the conversation that intrigued him. It wasn't just professional kindness. There was genuine wisdom in her words, an understanding of human suffering that wasn't learned in nursing textbooks. "Nurse Eliza," said Mr. Johnson, and now David had a name to associate with the face. "You have a very beautiful way of explaining things. Makes dying seem not so scary." Eliza smiled, and even in profile David could see that there was something luminous in that smile. "Dying isn't scary, Mr. Johnson. What's scary is thinking we'll die without having truly lived. But you've lived, raised children, loved a woman for 50 years, worked honestly. That never disappears." David felt a familiar discomfort spreading through his chest. Those words echoed dangerously close to thoughts he spent his days trying to avoid. Thoughts about the meaning of life, about the weight of time, about what really remains when everything ends. Thoughts about Claire. He moved away from the hallway without entering the room, postponing Mr. Johnson's checkup until later. He didn't want to interrupt that moment, but he also didn't want to keep watching. There was something disturbing about the way that nurse managed to touch wounds that he kept carefully bandaged. The rest of the day passed without other encounters with Eliza, but David found himself paying attention to colleagues' comments about the new employee. He discovered that she had arrived from Chicago the previous week, transferred through a Department of Health program to strengthen the palliative care sector. She had experience in large hospitals and excellent references. She was discreet, competent, and was living in a small apartment in the town center. Basic information, nothing that explained the uneasiness David felt whenever someone mentioned her name. It was as if Eliza's presence in the hospital had subtly altered the balance of forces he had built around himself, as if she were a stone thrown into a lake whose surface he carefully kept still. In the following week, casual encounters became more frequent. David saw her in the hallways, in the elevator, in the break room where doctors had coffee between appointments. Always serious, always focused on work, always with that air of someone carrying deeper thoughts than the current situation would demand. She greeted everyone politely, but didn't make efforts to make friends or participate in the team's informal conversations. It was during one of these coffee breaks that David witnessed his first direct conversation with Eliza. Dr. Henry, a young and extroverted cardiologist, was trying to extract personal information from her with the persistence of someone who doesn't easily accept no for an answer. "You can't be from Chicago and not root for any sports team," he was saying, leaning on the counter while stirring too much sugar into his coffee. "Every Chicagoan is born with the sports fanaticism gene." Eliza smiled politely, but David noticed that the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I never had much time to follow sports, Doctor. I was always more into reading in my spare time." "Reading what? Romance? Self-help? Don't tell me you're one of those who read Russian classics to impress others." The question sounded more aggressive than Henry probably intended, and David saw a shadow pass over Eliza's face before she answered. "Poetry, mainly. Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, T.S. Eliot. I think words have the power to heal as much as medicine sometimes." Henry laughed, a laugh that sounded forced and a bit cruel. "Poetry to heal? That's something from someone who's never seen people really dying. Here we save lives with science, not with pretty verses." David saw Eliza stiffen almost imperceptibly. She put the coffee cup in the sink, turned to Henry and spoke in a low voice, but charged with an authority that hadn't been present before. "Doctor, with all due respect, I spent the last 15 years working in ICUs and emergency departments. I've seen people dying and I've seen people being saved. And I've learned that there are moments when a pretty verse is exactly what stands between a person and total despair. Science saves the body. Words save the soul. And when you work with terminal patients, as I do, both are equally important." The silence that followed was awkward. Henry mumbled an apology and left the break room, leaving David alone with Eliza. She went back to washing the cup with controlled movements, but he could sense the tension in her shoulders. "He didn't mean to offend," said David, surprising himself by speaking. "Henry is a good doctor, but sometimes he doesn't measure his words." Eliza turned to him, and for the first time since she had arrived at the hospital, David looked directly into her eyes. They were dark, almost black, and there was a depth to them that made him feel as if he were looking into a well whose bottom he couldn't see. "I know," she said simply. "I don't mind different opinions. I just don't like when someone diminishes the work I do without knowing it." "Palliative care," said David, more to keep the conversation going than out of real curiosity. "Must be challenging." Something changed in Eliza's expression. She studied him for a moment as if assessing whether he was genuine or merely polite. "It's the most important work I've ever done," she finally said. "We can't save everyone, Doctor, but we can ensure that no one dies alone or afraid. We can make a person's final moments dignified and peaceful." David nodded, but again felt that familiar discomfort. The way she talked about death and dignity touched places in his soul that he preferred to keep locked. "That's an interesting perspective," he said, and realized he sounded more formal than he intended. Eliza smiled, but this time the smile seemed sad. "Sorry if it seemed like I was preaching, Doctor. It's just that sometimes I get excited when I talk about my work. No need to apologize. It's evident that you believe in what you do." "And you?" she asked, slightly tilting her head. "Do you believe in what you do?" The question caught him off guard, not by the simplicity of the words, but by the way she said them, as if she really wanted to know, as if the answer was important to her somehow. "Saving lives is always important," he answered, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't ask if it's important," said Eliza softly. "I asked if you believe in what you do." David remained silent for a moment, disturbed by the realization that there was a fundamental difference between the two questions. A difference he had never stopped to consider. "I have to get back to my appointments," he finally said, and left the break room without answering. But Eliza's question accompanied him for the rest of the day. During surgeries, between diagnoses, in moments when his mind wasn't completely occupied with medical issues, he found himself thinking about the difference between doing something important and believing in what you do. There was a time when this difference didn't exist for him. When he chose medicine, when he specialized in cardiovascular surgery, when he married Claire and built a life in Chicago, there was a clear sense of purpose that united his actions and his convictions. But after Claire died, after he fled to Pine Ridge, something had broken in that connection. He continued to be an exceptional surgeon, he continued to save lives and cure diseases, but he had lost the ability to feel that it was more than just a well-executed job. He had lost the ability to believe that his life had a meaning that went beyond technical competence. And now an unknown nurse, with her simple and direct question, had put her finger on a wound he didn't even know existed. In the following days, David found himself observing Eliza more attentively. It wasn't romantic interest, at least that's what he told himself. It was intellectual curiosity. There was something about her that didn't fit the pattern of people he knew. Something that made him suspect that behind that modest appearance and that dedication to work, there was a more complex story. He saw her talking to terminal patients, always with that particular mixture of gentleness and authority he had noticed on the first day. But he also began to notice small details that had initially gone unnoticed. The way she avoided being photographed when someone took informal team pictures. The excessive care with which she protected her cell phone, never leaving it unlocked even for a second. The way she changed the subject whenever someone asked questions about her life in Chicago. And there was something in her eyes, a shadow that appeared in moments when she thought no one was watching. An expression that David recognized because he saw it in his own mirror every day. The expression of someone carrying secrets too heavy to share. It was on a Thursday that he received the invitation to the charity gala. David found the envelope on his desk when he arrived at the office, along with the day's patient files. It was a formal invitation, printed on expensive paper, for an event sponsored by the City Hall with the aim of raising funds for hospital modernization. David looked at the invitation with irritation. He hated social events, especially those that forced doctors to play the role of local celebrities in front of politicians and businessmen who wanted to publicly associate themselves with noble causes. But he knew he couldn't miss it. As one of the most respected surgeons in the region, his presence was expected, and he had learned that in small towns, certain social obligations were inevitable. He put the invitation in the drawer, already planning to arrive late and leave early. Another wasted night. Another necessary sacrifice to maintain his professional position and personal tranquility. He had no idea that this charity gala would change his life forever. He had no idea that Eliza would be there. And much less did he have any idea what it would be like to see her away from the hospital environment, away from the uniform that hid who she really was, away from the professional persona she had built as carefully as he had built his. The fog continued to descend over Pine Ridge every morning, but something had changed in the air of the town. Something that David still couldn't name, but that was beginning to awaken sensations he had buried along with Claire on that icy December road. Sensations that frightened him more than any complex surgery or complicated diagnosis. Sensations that made him question if he was prepared to leave the emotional safety zone he had built around himself over the past 3 years. The answer would come in a few days, on a gala night that promised to be just another social obligation, but that would reveal itself as the beginning of a journey that would change everything he thought he knew about himself, about love, and about the possibility of rebuilding a life that seemed definitely lost. Saturday arrived grey and cold like all others in Pine Ridge, but this time David woke up with a different feeling in his chest. It wasn't exactly anxiety, but a restlessness that made him get out of bed half an hour before the alarm went off. He had spent the whole night dreaming about Claire again, fragmented dreams where she appeared in the hospital, wearing Eliza's lab coat, or where Eliza showed up in his kitchen preparing the breakfast that Claire used to make on weekends. He showered with water hotter than usual, letting the steam completely fog the bathroom mirror. He didn't want to see his own reflection that morning. There was something disturbing about the way thoughts about the two women were mixing in his mind, creating associations he couldn't control or understand. The day at the hospital passed in a succession of procedures that he executed with the automatic competence of always, but his concentration was strangely divided. During a bypass surgery that should have required his total attention, David found himself thinking about the way Eliza held the hands of terminal patients. There was something in that gesture that intrigued him deeply, a naturalness in human contact that he had lost since Claire's death. When was the last time he had touched someone in a genuine, non-professional way? When was the last time his hands had served to console instead of just to heal? The question bothered him so much that he needed to take a pause during the suture, pretending to check the patient's vital signs while reorganizing his thoughts. "Doctor, is everything okay?" asked the nurse assisting him, noticing his hesitation. "Perfect," he answered automatically. "Just checking if the anastomosis is adequate. But everything was not okay. There was a crack opening in the emotional armor he had so carefully built, and that crack had the exact shape of Eliza Morgan's dark eyes. At 5 in the afternoon, David was at home preparing for the charity gala, with the same enthusiasm as someone preparing for a dentist appointment. He chose the black tuxedo he had only worn 3 times since moving to Pine Ridge, always at mandatory events like this one. The clothes still smelled vaguely of the fabric softener that Claire used to use, and for a moment he considered changing outfits. But he decided that would be an unnecessary sentimental concession. He adjusted the bow tie in front of the bedroom mirror, avoiding looking directly at the reflection of the empty side of the bed. The house was too silent, as always, but today the silence seemed more oppressive, as if it were loaded with expectation for something he couldn't identify. The Pine Ridge Municipal Theatre was located in the historic center of the town, in a 19th-century building that had been restored with federal funds a few years earlier. David arrived 15 minutes late, calculatedly late, to avoid the boredom of preliminary conversations and inaugural speeches. The parking lot was full, with cars from all neighboring towns and some license plates from Denver and even Kansas City. Apparently, the gala had attracted more attention than he had imagined. The theater entrance was decorated with arrangements of white flowers and golden lights that created a solemn and elegant atmosphere. Men in tuxedos and women in long dresses climbed the marble staircase in small groups, talking in low tones that echoed in the main hall. David recognized some faces: the mayor and his wife, the hospital director and his entourage, local businessmen who always appeared at charity events to be photographed, donating symbolic checks. He greeted the necessary people with the professional politeness he had perfected over the years, accepted a glass of champagne he didn't intend to drink, and looked for a discreet corner where he could wait for the socially appropriate moment to leave. There were still 20 minutes until the official start of the event, and he was already calculating how long he would need to stay to not appear rude. It was then that the main doors of the hall opened once more, and David felt the air escape from his lungs in an involuntary exhalation that caught him completely off guard. Eliza entered the theater as if she had emerged from a dream he didn't know he was having. The black dress she wore wasn't extravagant or flashy. It was elegant in a subtle and sophisticated way that highlighted every line of her body without ever being vulgar. The fabric seemed to flow around her curves in a silent dance, revealing a silhouette that the hospital uniform had kept completely hidden. But it wasn't just the dress. It was everything. Her loose hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, capturing the golden light of the lamps and creating reflections that changed as she moved. The makeup was discreet but precise, enhancing her dark eyes in a way that made them even deeper and more mysterious. And there was something different in her posture, a quiet confidence that completely transformed the way she occupied the space around her. David stood motionless, the champagne glass forgotten in his hand, watching Eliza greet the receptionist and accept a program for the event. She seemed completely at ease in that environment, as if that natural elegance was something she had only temporarily put away, not something she had acquired for the occasion. Other people in the hall had also noticed her entrance. David noticed male gazes turning in her direction, conversations being interrupted for a few seconds, the kind of discreet but unequivocal attention that truly beautiful women attract without effort. And yet, Eliza seemed completely oblivious to the impact she was causing, or perhaps just accustomed to it. This raised a question that made David frown. If Eliza was capable of that transformation, if she possessed that natural beauty and that elegance, why did she choose to hide them so completely in the work environment? Why the constant disguise? Why the determination to go unnoticed? Before he could analyze these questions more deeply, Eliza's eyes met his across the hall. For a moment she seemed surprised, genuinely surprised, as if she didn't expect to find him there. Then her lips curved into a small, polite smile, and she nodded discreetly in his direction. David found himself walking across the hall without having made the conscious decision to do so. It was as if his body had taken control, guided by some impulse that his rational mind was still trying to process. When he got close to Eliza, he could smell the perfume she was wearing, something floral and subtle that completely contrasted with the total absence of fragrance that characterized her presence in the hospital. "Good evening, Doctor." "Mitchell," said Eliza, and even her voice seemed different. Not lower and contained, but clear and musical. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to see you either," he replied, and immediately realized the words had sounded more intimate than he intended. "I mean, I didn't know you would be coming to the event. The hospital distributed invitations to the entire staff," she explained, adjusting a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture that seemed simultaneously natural and studied. "I thought it would be a good opportunity to get to know the town better." David nodded, but he couldn't stop looking at her. It was as if he were seeing Eliza for the first time, as if the woman with whom he had exchanged polite words in the hospital corridors was a completely different person from the one standing before him now. "You look different," he said, choosing his words carefully. Eliza smiled, and there was something slightly melancholic in that smile. "Clothes make a difference, don't they? Sometimes it's good to remember that we are more than our work uniforms." Before David could respond, the sound of a discreet bell echoed through the hall, indicating that the event was about to begin. The guests started heading into the theater, and David found himself walking alongside Eliza without being sure how that had happened. The interior of the theater was even more impressive than the hall. Crystal chandeliers illuminated an auditorium decorated in shades of gold and red, with upholstered chairs arranged in elegant rows. The stage was set up for a musical presentation that would precede the speeches and the official part of the fundraising. David and Eliza found seats in the fifth row, not too close to the stage, but with an excellent view of the entire environment. As they settled in, David noticed how Eliza observed every detail of the decoration, as if she were memorizing the scene or looking for something specific. There was an attention in her eyes that went beyond mere tourist curiosity. "It's a beautiful theater," he commented, trying to start a conversation that would seem natural. "Very beautiful," she agreed. "How long have you lived in Pine Ridge, Doctor?" 3 years, said David, and immediately regretted being so specific. 3 years since Claire had died. 3 years since he had fled Chicago and all the memories he couldn't bear. "And do you like the town?" It was a simple question, but David realized he didn't have a simple answer. Would like be the appropriate word? He tolerated Pine Ridge. He had gotten used to it. He had found in it the kind of anesthetic tranquility he was looking for. But it's a quiet place, he finally said. "Good for someone who wants a life without complications." Eliza looked at him in a way that made him suspect she had noticed what he hadn't said. "And you?" he asked. "Are you enjoying it so far?" "It's different from Chicago," she replied, and there was something careful in the way she chose her words. "Sometimes changes are necessary, even when we don't plan them." There was a story behind that phrase. David could feel the weight of the unspoken words, the suggestion of circumstances that had forced an unwanted change. He wanted to ask more, but at that moment the theater lights dimmed and the musical presentation began. A string quartet performed classical pieces for 20 minutes, creating a solemn and elegant atmosphere that prepared the audience for the more formal part of the event. David tried to concentrate on the music, but was intensely aware of Eliza's presence beside him. He could hear her breathing, feel the heat emanating from her body, notice the small movements she made to adjust her dress. At one point, during a particularly beautiful passage of a Bach piece, David noticed that Eliza had closed her eyes and was smiling slightly. There was something deeply serene in that expression, as if the music was touching some part of her that rarely came to the surface. It was a private, intimate moment, and David felt like an intruder for watching, but he couldn't look away. When the music ended and applause echoed through the theater, Eliza opened her eyes and turned to him. For a second, their gazes met with an intensity that made David feel as if he had been touched by a low-voltage electric current. There was something in her eyes, a momentary vulnerability and openness, that disappeared almost immediately, replaced by the controlled politeness he knew from the hospital. The speeches that followed were predictable and tedious. The mayor spoke about the municipal administration's commitment to public health. The hospital director presented graphs about the need for equipment modernization. Local businessmen were called to the stage to deliver symbolic checks, while photographers captured every gesture for local newspapers. David listened to everything with the professional patience he had developed for this type of event, but his attention was divided between the speeches and the discreet observation of Eliza. She seemed genuinely interested in the presentations, taking small notes in a notebook she had taken from her purse. What kind of notes would a nurse make during a presentation about donations to hospitals? During the intermission, when guests were invited to the hall for a cocktail, David offered to get drinks for himself and Eliza. She asked for sparkling water with lemon. No alcohol, he noticed, and stayed waiting near one of the windows overlooking the street. When he returned with the drinks, he found Eliza observing the movement on the street through the glass. There was something thoughtful in her posture, almost melancholic. "Is everything okay?" he asked, offering the glass. "Yes, of course," she answered quickly, but David noticed that she had startled slightly, as if absorbed in thoughts she didn't want to share. "I was just observing the town. It's interesting how small places have their own dynamics, isn't it? Different from big cities where everyone is anonymous. Here everyone knows each other," agreed David. "It can be good or bad depending on what you're looking for." "And what were you looking for when you came here?" The question was asked with the same naturalness as someone asking about the weather, but David felt its weight like a punch to the stomach. No one in Pine Ridge had ever directly asked him about his motivations for leaving Chicago. People assumed it had been a professional matter, a better opportunity, the charm of small-town life. No one suspected the truth. "Tranquility," he finally said, and it wasn't a complete lie. Eliza nodded, but he had the impression that she had realized there was much more behind that one-word answer. "And you?" he asked, turning the tables. "What were you looking for?" For a moment Eliza remained silent, twirling the glass between her fingers and watching the carbon dioxide bubbles rise to the surface. "A fresh start," she finally said. "Sometimes life forces you to start over, even when you don't want to." There was a sadness in her voice that made David want to ask more, but before he could formulate the words, they were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Henry and his wife. "David, what a surprise to see you here," said Henry with the exaggerated enthusiasm of someone who had drunk more champagne than they should have. "And Nurse Eliza, my goodness, you're unrecognizable." In the best sense, of course. Henry's wife nudged her husband discreetly, clearly embarrassed by the lack of tact in the comment, but the damage was already done. David saw Eliza close up immediately, like a flower recoiling in the face of a cold wind. "Thank you," she said politely, but her voice had lost all the warmth it had moments before. "You should dress like this more often at the hospital," continued Henry, apparently oblivious to the discomfort he was causing. "Would liven up the place." "Henry," said David in a low but warning-laden voice, "I think you've had enough to drink for today." The young cardiologist laughed, but there was something nervous in the laugh. "Relax, David. I was just paying a compliment. Can't compliment a beautiful colleague anymore?" "You can," said Eliza softly, but there was steel in her voice. "As long as it's a professional compliment about the work she does, not about how she dresses or presents herself." The silence that followed was tense and awkward. Henry's wife muttered something about getting more drinks and practically dragged her husband away from the window. David and Eliza were alone again, but the atmosphere between them had changed. "Sorry about that," said David. "Henry isn't a bad guy, but sometimes he doesn't think before speaking." "You don't need to apologize for him," Eliza replied. "I've gotten used to that kind of comment." There was a bitterness in her voice that made David suspect she had faced much more than untimely comments throughout her career. There was a history of disrespect, of diminishment, of constant battles to be taken seriously as a professional, and suddenly he felt ashamed for having done exactly the same thing, judging her by her appearance, categorizing her as someone without luster on the first day. "You shouldn't have to get used to it," he said. Eliza looked at him with an expression that seemed to assess whether he was being sincere or merely polite. "It's kind of you to say that," she finally answered. "But the world is what it is. Women in medicine know they have to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition. And if you're beautiful, then it's assumed you can't be competent too. Is that why you—" he began, and then stopped, realizing he was about to enter dangerous territory. "Why I what?" "Why you hide yourself at the hospital," he said, choosing his words very carefully. The oversized uniform, the hair always tied back, the lack of makeup. It's a conscious strategy. Eliza remained silent for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to decide if she could trust him with a personal truth. "Partly," she finally admitted, "but also because it's easier. When people don't see you as a woman first, they have a better chance of seeing you as a professional. And today I wanted to remember what it's like to be seen," she said, and there was something almost defiant in her voice. "Even if it's just for one night." Before David could respond, the sound of the bell echoed through the hall again, indicating that the second part of the event was about to begin. They returned to their seats in the theatre, but something had changed in the dynamic between them. There was a new honesty, a layer of pretense that had been removed. The second part of the gala consisted of a contemporary dance performance, followed by more speeches, and the official part of the fundraising. David found it all tedious, but noticed that Eliza seemed absorbed by the dance presentation. There was something in the way she observed the dancers' movements that suggested familiarity with that type of art. "Do you dance?" he asked in a low voice during a pause between presentations. "I used to," she answered without taking her eyes off the stage. "A long time ago." One more layer of Eliza's personality that he hadn't suspected. How many more were there? How many aspects of herself did she keep carefully hidden? When the event finally ended, it was past 11 at night. The guests began to slowly disperse, forming small groups in the hall for final conversations before departing. David and Eliza left the theatre together, and he offered to walk her to her car. "I didn't bring a car," she said. "I came by taxi. I can give you a ride home." Eliza hesitated, and for a moment David thought she might accept, but then she shook her head. "Thank you, but I prefer to call another taxi. It's more appropriate." Appropriate. The word echoed in David's mind as he watched Eliza move toward the taxi stand at the corner of the theatre. Appropriate because they were work colleagues. Appropriate because they barely knew each other. Appropriate because there was something between them that both were determined not to acknowledge. David stood on the sidewalk, watching the taillights of the taxi disappear into the fog that always covered the streets of Pine Ridge during the night. He felt like a teenager who had just discovered what physical attraction was, a sensation simultaneously exciting and deeply disturbing. On the way home, driving through the empty streets of the town, he tried to process what had happened that night. He had seen Eliza in a completely new way, had talked with her about subjects that went far beyond basic professional courtesy, had felt a connection he hadn't experienced with anyone since Claire's death, and at the same time, he had realized that he barely knew Eliza Morgan. There were layers and layers of personal history that she kept carefully hidden. There was a sadness in her eyes that spoke of losses and disappointments. There was a caution in the way she related to people that suggested painful experiences in the past. When he got home, David took a long hot shower, trying to wash away the feeling that something fundamental had changed that night. But as he lay in bed looking at the dark ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about Eliza's smile during the musical presentation, the way she had talked about dance with nostalgia, the momentary vulnerability he had seen in her eyes. And mainly, he couldn't stop thinking about what she had said about being seen, as if that need was something she had denied herself for a long time, as if the beauty she possessed was simultaneously a gift and a curse that she didn't know how to manage. On the following Monday, Eliza returned to the hospital with the usual uniform, her hair tied back, makeup absent, as if the elegant and sophisticated woman from the gala had been just a mirage, a shared dream that both had decided to forget. But David couldn't forget. And even more disturbing, he couldn't stop observing her. He observed the way she held the pen when filling out reports, the way her lips moved when she talked quietly with patients, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrated. Gestures he had never noticed before that now seemed loaded with meaning, and he began to realize that she was observing him too. Not in an obvious way, but with the same discretion he used. Quick glances when she believed he wasn't paying attention, an almost imperceptible hesitation when their paths crossed in the corridors. A different way of saying, "Good morning, doctor," that carried echoes of the conversation they had had in the theatre. The tension between them grew like a storm forming on the horizon, still distant but inexorable. There were moments of almost contact, when he passed a medical chart to her and their fingers touched for a fraction of a second, when they found themselves alone in the elevator, and the silence extended for a few seconds longer than would be natural. When she laughed at some comment he made, and the sound of that laughter made him feel as if something dormant inside him was awakening. It was dangerous. It was inappropriate. It was exactly the kind of complication that David had come to Pine Ridge to avoid. And yet for the first time in 3 years he felt completely alive. The 5 days following the charity gala passed with torturous slowness, as if time had acquired a denser, more resistant consistency. David found himself constantly looking at the clock, not because he was in a hurry for any appointment, but because the minutes seemed to drag with deliberate laziness whenever Eliza was nearby. And she was nearby with a frequency that couldn't be coincidence. On Tuesday, she appeared in the break room exactly when he was preparing his afternoon coffee, as if she had synchronized her break with his. On Wednesday, he met her in the hospital parking lot when he was leaving for lunch, and they walked together to the main street without either of them explicitly suggesting the company. On Thursday, she was in the hospital's medical library when he went to consult an article on cardiology, and they ended up sitting at the same table for 40 minutes, reading in silence, but intensely aware of each other's breathing. These weren't planned meetings. At least that's what David told himself. They were coincidences that happened because they worked in the same place at the same hours, following similar routines. But there was something in the way Eliza always appeared in the right places, at the right times, that suggested careful orchestration, as if she were testing the limits of something neither of them wanted to name. And David, to his own surprise, wasn't doing anything to avoid these meetings. On the contrary, he was starting to adjust his own schedules, his own routes through the hospital, in a way that maximized the chances of crossing paths with her. It was a dangerous and silent game, a dance of approach that both executed with the perfection of those who had learned to move in the shadows of their own feelings. During these casual interactions, the conversations remained safe, professional, carefully neutral. They talked about clinical cases, about the hospital's needs, about the weather changes that affected patients' moods. But there were undercurrents in every word, layers of meaning that transformed even the most banal comments into small veiled confessions. When Eliza mentioned she was having difficulty sleeping because of the excessive silence of Pine Ridge, David heard not just an observation about the difference between a small town and a metropolis, but an admission of insomnia, of sleepless nights, possibly spent thinking about the same things that kept him awake. When he commented that he had started taking morning walks to enjoy the fresh mountain air, she heard not just a healthy habit, but a confession of restlessness, of energy that needed to be spent to avoid dangerous thoughts. It was a coded language that both instinctively mastered, a code that allowed intimate communication without crossing lines they weren't yet prepared to cross. But what most disturbed David was the way Eliza had begun to inhabit not just the physical spaces of his routine, but also the most reserved corners of his mind. He found himself thinking of her at completely inappropriate moments, during surgeries, when he should be focused exclusively on the life in his hands, during consultations, when he should be entirely focused on the patient in front of him, and especially during lonely nights at home, when Claire's absence strangely mixed with Eliza's imaginary presence. It was as if two women were competing for the same emotional space inside him. Claire with all the weight of the past, of guilt, of love, violently interrupted, and Eliza with all the promise of a present that he didn't know if he had the courage to embrace. The situation was emotionally unsustainable, and David knew that something would have to give soon. The answer came on a rainy Friday in March, when he was scheduled for the night shift along with a reduced team. Friday nights at St. Thomas Hospital were generally quiet. Most elective procedures were scheduled for other days of the week, and true emergencies were relatively rare in a town the size of Pine Ridge. David had arrived at the hospital at 7 in the evening, after a particularly exhausting day at the office. 3 surgeries in the morning, 12 consultations in the afternoon, and the persistent feeling that he was functioning on autopilot without being able to genuinely connect with the work he was doing. It was as if a part of himself had temporarily disconnected, leaving only professional reflexes and technical competence to maintain appearances. The night shift had a different atmosphere from the hospital's daytime movement. The corridors were quieter, illuminated only by emergency lights that created long dramatic shadows on the walls. The number of staff was reduced to the necessary minimum, creating a sense of forced intimacy among those who stayed. And there was something in the quality of the silence, interrupted only by the occasional beeps of monitors and the whisper of ventilation systems, that made each casual encounter more loaded with meaning. David was in the doctor's lounge reviewing medical charts when he discovered that Eliza was also scheduled for that night. Not in the same sector. She would be in the palliative care wing while he covered emergency and ICU, but in the same building, breathing the same recycled air, sharing the same hours of vigil while the rest of the town slept. The information hit him like a shot of adrenaline. Suddenly, the prospect of spending 12 hours in the hospital no longer seemed like a tedious obligation, but an opportunity he didn't quite know how to take advantage of. The first hours of the shift passed without significant incidents. David attended to 2 minor cases in the emergency room, a child with a high fever that was resolved with medication, and an elderly man with chest pains that turned out to be caused by anxiety, not heart problems. Between the attendances, he allowed himself some walks through the corridors, ostensibly to check how busy the hospital was, but actually hoping to find Eliza. He saw her for the first time that night a little after 10 o'clock, when he passed by the palliative care wing on his way to the break room. She was sitting beside the bed of an elderly lady, holding her hand and talking in a low voice. There was something deeply serene in the scene, an intimacy that spoke of long years of experience in being present for people in their most vulnerable moments. David stopped at the door for a few seconds, observing the way Eliza tilted her head to better hear what the patient was whispering. There was a complete attention in that gesture, a total presence that dramatically contrasted with the distraction he himself had felt throughout the day. It was as if Eliza possessed a natural talent for genuinely connecting with human suffering, while he had lost that ability somewhere between Claire's death and the move to Pine Ridge. When Eliza finally noticed his presence at the door, she smiled discreetly and made a gesture indicating that she would need a few more minutes with the patient. David nodded and continued toward the break room, but carried with him the image of that smile, tired but genuine, charged with a tenderness he didn't know still existed in the world. Half an hour later, Eliza appeared in the break room where he was drinking coffee and trying to read a medical article that he couldn't absorb. She looked exhausted, but there was a quiet satisfaction in her expression. "How was it with Mrs. Everett?" he asked, surprising himself by remembering the patient's name. "She's more at peace now," Eliza replied, serving herself a cup of chamomile tea. "Sometimes people just need to talk about the children they raised, the places they visited, the good things they did in life. It's as if they're organizing their memories before departing." David nodded, but the simplicity of that observation hit him with unexpected force. When was the last time he had thought about the good things he had done in life? When was the last time he had organized his own memories in a way that found satisfaction instead of regret? "It must be difficult," he said, "being present for so many goodbyes." Eliza sat in the chair next to him, and David noticed that she seemed smaller, more fragile under the fluorescent light of the break room. There were dark circles under her eyes that the discreet makeup couldn't completely hide. "It is difficult," she admitted, "but it's also a privilege. How many people have the opportunity to help someone die in peace? To be the last person to hold someone's hand, the last voice they hear. It's an enormous responsibility, but it's also sacred in a way." The word sacred echoed in David's mind. When was the last time he had felt that his work had any sacred dimension? When was the last time he had felt genuinely connected to the purpose of healing, instead of just executing technical procedures with competence? "Did you always know you wanted to work in palliative care?" he asked. Eliza remained silent for a moment, turning the cup between her fingers in a way that had become familiar to him. "No," she finally said. "Actually, I started in nursing, wanting to work in pediatrics. I wanted to care for sick children, help families through difficult times, but with hope of cure, you know? Palliative care was the last thing I imagined doing." "What changed?" Another pause, longer this time. David had the impression that Eliza was deciding how much of her personal story she could share with him. "Life happened," she finally said, and there was a subtle bitterness in her voice. "I learned that sometimes the most important thing we can do for someone is not to save them. It's to be present while they save themselves, or while they prepare to depart." There were layers of meaning in that phrase that David couldn't completely decipher, but he could feel the emotional weight behind the words. There was a story of personal loss there, an experience that had fundamentally changed the way Eliza saw life and death. Before he could ask more, the lights in the break room flickered once, then twice, and then went out completely. The hospital was plunged into a sudden and absolute darkness, broken only by the red illumination of the emergency lights that automatically turned on. "Power outage," said Eliza unnecessarily, but her voice sounded louder than intended in the sudden silence. David stood up instinctively, his medical reflexes taking control. In hospitals, power outages were serious emergencies. Patients on life support could be at risk, essential equipment could fail, and the entire functioning of the institution depended on constant electrical power. The emergency generators should start in a few seconds, he said, more to reassure himself than Eliza. But the seconds passed, and the power didn't come back. They left the break room together, using the flashlights on their cell phones to navigate the corridors. The hospital had been transformed into a labyrinth of red shadows, with the emergency lights creating an almost supernatural environment. Other staff appeared from different directions, all converging on the nursing station, where information about what was happening was concentrated. The picture that emerged in the quick and anxious conversations of the staff was concerning. The power outage had affected the entire region, not just the hospital. A strong storm had knocked down the main transmission lines, and there was no prediction of when power would be restored. The hospital's emergency generators had worked for a few minutes but then failed, apparently due to a maintenance problem that had gone unnoticed in routine inspections. The situation was serious but not desperate. Patients in critical condition had been transferred to equipment with independent batteries, and most of the hospitalized were stable. Still, it would be necessary to completely reorganize the hospital's functioning until power returned. It was during this emergency reorganization that David and Eliza ended up trapped in the elevator. They were going to the 5th floor to check on cardiac patients when the elevator abruptly stopped between the 3rd and 4th floors. The doors didn't open and the buttons didn't respond. The cabin was illuminated only by the weak light of cell phones and the red emergency lighting that filtered through the cracks in the doors. "We'll have to wait," said David, after unsuccessfully trying to activate the elevator's emergency system. "With the general power out, it will take time for them to get us out of here." Eliza leaned against the wall at the back of the cabin, and in the red light her silhouette seemed almost ethereal. "How long do you think?" "Could be an hour. Maybe more." They remained silent for a few minutes, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The elevator space, which normally seemed spacious enough, had become intimately small. David could hear Eliza's breathing, could smell the subtle perfume she wore, could notice every small movement she made. It was a forced intimacy that put into perspective all the weeks of careful dance they had executed in the hospital corridors. Here, in that confined space, social pretenses and professional barriers seemed simultaneously more important and completely irrelevant. "David," said Eliza suddenly, and it was the first time she had called him by his first name. The informality sounded strange and intimate in the stuffy air of the elevator. "Yes? Can I ask you something personal?" He hesitated. Personal questions were exactly the kind of thing he had spent 3 years avoiding. But there, in that space suspended between floors, between day and night, between professional life and something deeper, the usual rules didn't seem to apply. "You can," he said. "Are you happy here in Pine Ridge?" The question was simple, but the answer was infinitely complex. Happy was a word that David had eliminated from his emotional vocabulary. There was content, satisfied, functional. There was the absence of acute unhappiness. But happy. "I don't know if I know anymore what it means to be happy," he said honestly. "I understand," said Eliza, and there was something in her voice that suggested she really did understand. "Sometimes we spend so much time pretending to be okay that we forget the difference between being okay and just not bad." The precision of that observation hit him like a punch to the stomach. That was exactly what he had done in the past 3 years. Built a life that wasn't unhappy, but that was far from being genuinely happy. A safe, predictable, emotionally anesthetized life. "And you?" he asked. "Are you happy?" Eliza laughed, but it was a laugh without humor. "I don't even know if I deserve to be happy anymore." The vulnerability in that confession made him want to get closer to her, offer some kind of comfort, but at the same time, there was something in her words that suggested a complicated story, perhaps dangerous to explore. "Why do you say that?" For a long moment, the only sound in the elevator was that of their breathing, slightly labored due to the rarefied air. David began to think that Eliza wasn't going to answer when she spoke again. Because sometimes the choices we make, even when we believe they're right, end up hurting people we love. And then it becomes difficult to forgive yourself. There was genuine pain in her voice, a guilt that echoed familiar in David's ears. It was the kind of guilt he carried every day since Claire's death. The guilt of not having done enough, of not having been better, of having let pride and fear interfere with love. "I know how it is," he said quietly. "You do?" "My wife," he began, and then stopped. It had been 3 years since he had talked about Claire with anyone. 3 years keeping that story as a poisonous secret that corroded him from the inside. "You don't have to," began Eliza. "No," he interrupted. "I need to. It's been 3 years since I've told this to anyone." And then, in the darkness of the elevator, with only the red light from the emergency lamps illuminating fragments of Eliza's face, David told the story he had promised to take to the grave. He told about Claire, about the marriage that had been genuinely happy for 8 years. He told about the small fights that all couples have, about the professional tensions that sometimes infiltrated domestic life. He told about that December night, when they fought over something so insignificant that he couldn't even remember the exact reason. She was stressed about work, he said, and his voice sounded strange in the elevator's acoustics. She had lost a patient the week before, a child, and that always affected her deeply. She was a pediatrician, you know, and when she got like that, she became more sensitive, more reactive to anything. Eliza listened in silence, without interrupting, without offering comments. Just present as he had seen her be with terminal patients. "I got home late, tired from a difficult day at the hospital. She was drinking wine alone in the kitchen, which was already a sign that something was wrong. Claire only drank when she was very upset. And instead of asking what was happening, instead of trying to understand, I got irritated that she was drunk on a weekday." The memory came back with painful clarity. Claire sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing her pediatrician's coat, a half-empty glass of red wine in front of her, the red eyes of someone who had been crying, the defensive posture of someone who was waiting for yet another disappointment. "The fight escalated quickly," continued David. "I said cruel things about her not being able to handle work professionally. She said cruel things about me being emotionally unavailable, and then she decided to leave the house. It was raining," he continued, and his voice began to tremble slightly. "December in Chicago, you know how it is. Cold rain, terrible traffic, and she was intoxicated. I knew she was intoxicated. I saw her grab the car keys, saw her stagger slightly when she got up. And you didn't stop her." "I didn't stop her," he confirmed, and the confession came out like a confession of murder. "I sat in that kitchen, finishing the wine she had left, telling myself that she was being dramatic, that she would come back in an hour asking for forgiveness, that it was just another of our silly fights that would be resolved with a night's sleep." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the weight of a guilt that David had carried alone for 3 years. "The accident happened 15 miles from home," he finally said. "On a wet curve of the road that led to her sister's house, the car skidded and hit a tree. She died instantly." Eliza didn't say anything for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "It wasn't your fault." "Yes, it was," he answered automatically. "If I had held her back, if I had been less proud, if I had realized she was suffering instead of just being irritated." "David," said Eliza, and this time there was authority in her voice, "I work with people who are dying every day. I work with families who carry guilt for things they didn't do, should have done differently. And I've learned one thing. Guilt is an emotion that makes us feel we have more control over life than we really do." She paused, and David could feel that she was choosing her words carefully. Claire made a choice that night. A dangerous, impulsive choice. But her choice. You didn't put her in the car, you didn't make it rain, you didn't create the dangerous curve. You were just a human husband having a human fight with a human wife. Eliza's words created a small crack in the wall of guilt that David had built around Claire's memory. Not enough to instantly collapse everything, but enough to let in a little light. "Is that why you came to Pine Ridge?" she asked gently. "I couldn't live in Chicago anymore," he admitted. "Everything reminded me of her. The apartment, the hospital, the streets we walked together. I needed a place where I could function without being constantly reminded of what I had lost." "And did it work?" David thought about the question. It had worked to a certain extent. He had managed to build a routine, a respectable professional life, a quiet and predictable existence. But at the same time, it had only worked as a sophisticated form of escape. "For a while," he said. "Until you arrived." The words came out without him having planned to say that. In the silence that followed, David could hear his own heart beating faster. "I disturbed your peace," said Eliza, and it wasn't a question. "Completely," he confirmed. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," said David, and this time it was he who turned to look directly at her in the red light of the elevator. "I think I needed to have my peace disturbed." There was something in the way she was looking at him that made the air in the elevator seem even scarcer, an intensity that spoke of mutual attraction, of weeks of accumulated tension, of two adults who had spent too long denying something that was becoming impossible to ignore. "Eliza," he said, and his voice came out hoarser than intended. "Yes? There's something between us that isn't just professional." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "There is. It's dangerous." "It is. We work together. I'm older. You have an entire life here that I don't know about. There are 1,000 reasons why this would be a bad idea." "I know," said Eliza, but she had moved a step closer to him in the small elevator cabin. And yet, she repeated. The moment before the kiss stretched like a suspended eternity. David could feel the heat emanating from Eliza's body, could see the way her lips were slightly parted, could notice the slight tremor in her hands, indicating she was as nervous as he was. When their lips finally met, it was with the hesitant gentleness of two people who knew they were crossing a line they couldn't uncross. The kiss began as a question, soft and exploratory, as if they were testing whether that connection they had felt for weeks was real or just an illusion created by the tension of the hospital environment. But when Eliza responded, leaning closer to him and allowing her fingers to lightly touch his chest, the kiss deepened into an intensity that surprised them both. There was hunger there, a need that went far beyond physical attraction. It was as if two people who had spent too long emotionally isolated had finally found someone who understood the depth of their loneliness. When they separated, both were breathing heavily. The elevator cabin seemed to have gotten even smaller, and the air between them was charged with electricity. "This complicates everything," said David, but there was no regret in his voice. "I know," Eliza replied, "but maybe some complications are worth it." Before he could respond, the elevator moved abruptly downward with a jolt that made them lean on each other to maintain balance. The normal lights came on, and the familiar sound of the electrical system coming back to life echoed through the hospital. The doors opened on the 3rd floor, revealing two maintenance technicians who had come to the rescue. To the outside world, they were just two health professionals who had been trapped during a power failure. No one could see that something fundamental had changed between them in that hour of darkness. "Are you okay?" asked one of the technicians. "We are," said David. But when he looked at Eliza, he knew that neither of them was really okay. They were deeply, irrevocably altered by that hour of forced intimacy. The rest of the night passed in a haze of professional activities. They checked on patients, helped reorganize equipment that had been affected by the blackout, filled out reports about incidents that occurred during the power failure. But in each brief interaction, a chart passed from one hand to another, a look that lingered for a few seconds longer than would be appropriate. There was the echo of that kiss in the elevator. When the shift ended at 7 on Saturday morning, they left the hospital together but in silence. The town was slowly waking up, with some businesses opening their doors and the first passers-by appearing on the streets, covered by the morning fog. "David," said Eliza when they reached the parking lot. "Yes? What happened in the elevator?" "You don't need to say anything," he gently interrupted. "I know it was intense. I know it complicated things. I won't pressure you for anything." Eliza smiled, but there was something sad in that smile. "It's not that, it's just that there are things about me you don't know, things that might change how you feel. We all have pasts, Eliza. We all have things we wish we had done differently. Some pasts are more complicated than others," she said cryptically. David wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what was behind the melancholy that had appeared in her eyes, but he also knew that pushing would be a mistake. What had happened between them was too new, too fragile to bear the weight of dramatic revelations. "When you're ready to talk about it, I'll be here," he said simply. Eliza nodded, got into her small car and drove away, leaving David alone in the parking lot with the taste of the kiss still on his lips. and a feeling that his life had begun a new phase that would be simultaneously wonderful and dangerous. In the days that followed, they established a new routine. Casual encounters that were no longer casual, conversations that started professionally and slowly became personal, moments of physical proximity that tested the limits of what was appropriate in the work environment. But there was also a new caution in Eliza's behavior, a way of looking over her shoulder that suggested she was constantly worried about something David couldn't identify. And sometimes when she thought he wasn't watching, he saw that shadow in her eyes, an expression of someone who carried secrets too heavy to share. It was only a matter of time until those secrets began to emerge, and when that happened, David would have to decide if he was prepared to love a woman whose past might be much more complicated than he imagined. What began as a kiss in the elevator transformed in the following 2 weeks into a delicate and dangerous dance between desire and discretion. David and Eliza developed their own language, made of gazes sustained for a second longer than would be professionally appropriate, of accidental touches that lasted too long, of seemingly innocent conversations loaded with double meanings that only they could decipher. It was as if the entire hospital had become a stage where they performed a complex play for an audience that couldn't know they were acting. During the day, they maintained the facade of professional cordiality. David was the respected, reserved, but always polite doctor. Eliza was the competent nurse, discreet and dedicated to work. But underneath this daily performance, there was an underground current of sexual and emotional tension that constantly threatened to emerge to the surface. The true encounters happened at the edges of the normal schedule, in the marginal spaces and moments of the hospital routine. A 15-minute conversation in the medical library when the rest of the team had gone to lunch. An apparently casual meeting in the parking lot at 7 in the morning when David arrived early and Eliza was leaving a night shift. 20 minutes stolen in the break room during shift changes when they could speak without professional masks about literature, about music, about the small observations of daily life that gained disproportionate importance when shared with someone who truly listened. It was during one of these intimate conversations that David began to notice the first of many intriguing contradictions in Eliza's personality. They were discussing books. He had mentioned he was rereading The Great Gatsby to try to better understand classic American literature, and she had laughed genuinely for the first time since they had met. Faulkner would be a better choice to start, she said, adjusting a strand of hair behind her ear, in a gesture that had become familiar and disturbingly attractive to him. The Sound and the Fury, or As I Lay Dying. Faulkner understands the subtleties of human nature in a way that Fitzgerald never managed. The observation was sophisticated, revealing a knowledge of American literature that went far beyond what would be expected from someone who had studied nursing and spent her career in hospitals. When David commented on this, Eliza became slightly flushed and muttered something about having had a good literature teacher in high school. But there was something in the way she spoke about Faulkner, a familiarity not only with the books, but with literary criticism, with the nuances of academic interpretation, that suggested a much more formal education than she was willing to admit. It was as if she had studied literature at a university level, perhaps even advanced, but didn't want him to know that. Another contradiction emerged when they were talking about travel. David had mentioned that he had never left the United States, that his only knowledge of other countries came from books and documentaries. Eliza commented, apparently without thinking, about how the Gothic churches of Paris were different from the ones she had seen in Barcelona, and how the golden light of Tuscany really justified all the romanticization it received in literature. When David asked when she had been to Europe, Eliza paused for a very long moment before answering that she had taken a graduation trip many years ago, saving money for years to fulfill a youthful dream. But there was something in the way she described the places, not with the excitement of a tourist, but with the familiarity of someone who had spent considerable time in these cities, that didn't fit the story of a single graduation trip. These small inconsistencies might have gone unnoticed by someone less observant, but David had spent years developing the ability to read people. As a surgeon, one learns to perceive the subtle signs that patients give about their true state of health, the small lies they tell to minimize symptoms or hide destructive habits. And as a widower, he had developed an acute sensitivity to detect when someone was hiding pain. Eliza was definitely hiding something. Not just pain, though there was that too, but an entire story that didn't align with the simple narrative she presented about herself. The most disturbing discovery came on a Thursday afternoon when David needed to pick up some tests from the laboratory and passed by the palliative care wing. He saw Eliza talking with an elderly patient, as she always did, but this time he noticed something that had gone unnoticed before. Eliza's purse was resting on a nearby chair, slightly open, and he could see the corner of a sealed envelope that she carried constantly. It wasn't the presence of the envelope that intrigued him. Many people carried important documents, but the obsessive way Eliza protected that purse. She never left it alone, not even for a minute. She took it to the bathroom, to the break room, to any place she went. And whenever anyone got too close to the purse, she instinctively pulled it closer to her body. There was something in that envelope that was crucial to her, something she couldn't risk being seen by other people. But what would a nurse carry that was so important that she couldn't leave it at home or in a secure locker? The question became even more intriguing at the end of that week, when David received the first anonymous note. He was in his office between 2 afternoon consultations when he found an envelope without a return address on his desk. Inside was a sheet of common paper with a message typed in standard font. "Dr. Mitchell, do you really know Nurse Eliza Morgan? Some people aren't who they appear to be." David read the note 3 times before throwing it in the trash, irritated. Pine Ridge was a small town, where gossip and personal intrigues were common entertainment. Probably some hospital employee had noticed the attention he was giving to Eliza and decided to create drama where none existed. Or perhaps it was someone who had tried to get close to her without success and was trying to sabotage her out of revenge. But even having rationalized the note as irrelevant, David couldn't completely rid himself of the feeling of discomfort it had created. Not because he necessarily believed the insinuation, but because it echoed his own doubts that he had begun to develop about the contradictions in Eliza's personal history. The second note arrived 3 days later, and this one was more specific. It contained newspaper clippings, old articles about a corruption scandal in hospital contracts in Chicago. One of the names mentioned in the articles was highlighted with yellow marker, Mark Anderson. David didn't immediately recognize the name, but there was something familiar about it. He spent the rest of the day with that irritating feeling that he was forgetting something important, like when you have a word on the tip of your tongue but can't remember it. It was only the following night, during an insomnia that had become common since he began to become emotionally involved with Eliza, that the memory connected. Mark Anderson had been mentioned in a conversation he had overheard by chance at the hospital a few weeks earlier. 2 administration employees were commenting about old problems with suppliers, and one of them had said something about, "We don't want another Mark Anderson case here." The next morning, David did something he never imagined he would do. He began to investigate Eliza. He started discreetly, asking colleagues about her transfer from Chicago. The information he got was limited and consistent with what she had already told. Experienced nurse, excellent references, transferred through a Department of Health program. But when he tried to obtain details about which hospital in Chicago she had worked at before, the answers were vague. Northwestern Memorial, said one. University of Chicago Medical Center, said another. Rush University Medical Center, speculated a third. It was strange that no one was sure. Transfers of specialized staff usually came with detailed documentation about previous experience, especially when they involved state programs. And Eliza was clearly an exceptional professional. Why wouldn't there be clear records of where she had developed this competence? The internet search was even more frustrating. Eliza Morgan Nurse Chicago generated hundreds of irrelevant results. Eliza Morgan Northwestern Memorial didn't bring anything specific. It was as if she had a minimal digital presence, almost non-existent for someone who had worked in important hospitals in a city like Chicago. It was when he searched for Mark Anderson hospital contracts that the situation became genuinely concerning. The story that emerged from the newspaper articles was complex and sordid. Mark Anderson had been an employee in the contracts and acquisitions sector of a major Chicago hospital, accused of favoring specific suppliers in exchange for bribes and personal benefits. The scheme had diverted millions of dollars that should have been used for medical equipment and facility improvements. But what made the case particularly scandalous was that Anderson had disappeared a few days before the trial. taking with him documents that could have implicated other people in the corruption network. His escape had left several questions unanswered and several people under suspicion. Among these people was his wife, Eliza Anderson. The name hit David like a punch to the stomach. Eliza Anderson. Not Eliza Morgan. She had changed her surname, probably returning to her maiden name or adopting a completely new name. The articles about her were limited, but painted a disturbing picture. She had been extensively questioned by the police about her husband's whereabouts and about her possible knowledge of the corruption scheme. Although she had never been formally charged, there were suspicions that she knew more than she admitted about Mark's activities. An anonymous source cited in one of the articles claimed that Eliza had had access to financial documents and correspondence that could have revealed the scheme long before it was discovered by the authorities. The implication was that she had chosen to protect her husband instead of reporting the irregularities. After Mark's disappearance, Eliza had become a figure of continuing interest to investigators, not as a direct suspect, but as someone who might have crucial information about where her husband was hiding and about others involved in the scheme who had not yet been identified. David closed the laptop with his hands trembling slightly. The woman he was falling in love with, the woman he had kissed in the elevator and with whom he had shared his most painful memories about Claire, was possibly complicit in a corruption scheme that had diverted money intended to save lives. But at the same time, a part of him refused to accept this narrative. The Eliza he knew, the woman who held the hands of terminal patients, who recited poetry to comfort the dying, who had listened to his confession about Claire with genuine compassion, didn't seem capable of consciously participating in something so sordid. There were alternative explanations. Perhaps she had been manipulated by her husband. Perhaps she didn't really know what was happening. Perhaps her escape to Pine Ridge was exactly what it seemed, an attempt to start over away from a painful and complicated past. But then why the anonymous notes? Who was sending that information, and why? And why now, just when he and Eliza were getting closer? The answer to these questions came in a way that David would never have anticipated. On the following Friday, he was leaving the hospital after a particularly exhausting day when he noticed a man standing next to his car in the parking lot. The man was tall, thin, wearing a dark suit that looked expensive but was slightly wrinkled. He had the appearance of someone who traveled a lot and hadn't had time to properly care for his appearance. "Dr. Mitchell," the man said when David approached. "Yes? My name is Robert Carter. I'm a private investigator. I'd like to talk to you about Eliza Morgan." David felt his stomach tighten, but tried to keep a neutral expression. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," said Carter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You received some informative materials recently, didn't you? About Nurse Morgan's past?" The anonymous notes. This man was who had sent them. "What do you want?" asked David, abandoning any pretense of ignorance. "I want to find Mark Anderson," said Carter directly, "and I believe your little girlfriend can help me with that." "She's not my little girlfriend," David automatically lied. "Of course not," said Carter with sarcasm. "That's why you two were trapped alone in an elevator for an hour and came out with completely different expressions. That's why you meet in the hospital library after hours. That's why you started arriving earlier and she started doing overtime on days when you have shifts." The precision of the observations was disturbing. This man had been watching the two much more closely than David had imagined. "Who hired you?" asked David. "That doesn't matter," replied Carter. "What matters is that my client has an interest in locating Mark Anderson and recovering certain documents he took when he disappeared, documents that could compromise important people. And you think Eliza knows where he is? I know she knows. The question is whether she will reveal the information voluntarily or if she'll need incentive." There was an implicit threat in Carter's words that made David straighten up. "If you're threatening her—" "I'm not threatening anyone, Doctor. I'm just clarifying the situation. Eliza Anderson, because that's her real name, has information my client needs. She can choose to cooperate, or she can choose to make things difficult for everyone involved, including you. I have nothing to do with this. Yes, you do, from the moment you got involved with her. And from what I've observed, you two are quite involved." Carter moved away from David's car and walked toward a gray Corolla parked a few spaces away. "Think about what we discussed, Doctor. And maybe it would be a good idea to have a frank conversation with your friend about what she's really hiding. Some truths are better when they come from people we trust. David stood in the parking lot for several minutes after Carter left, trying to process what had just happened. The situation had escalated from complicated romance to something potentially dangerous. There were forces in motion that he didn't fully understand, people looking for Eliza for reasons that could be legitimate or criminal, and at the center of it all was the woman he was falling in love with, carrying secrets that could destroy them both. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, looking at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the two versions of Eliza that now coexisted in his mind. The compassionate nurse he knew daily, and the possible accomplice to corruption that the newspapers described. There were moments when he could almost convince himself that it was all a misunderstanding, that Eliza was just a victim of circumstances who had been dragged into a situation she couldn't control. But then he remembered the obsessive way she protected that purse, the envelope she constantly carried, the small contradictions in her personal history. And mainly, he remembered what Carter had said about incentive. There was something in the way the investigator had pronounced that word that suggested he wasn't just talking about verbal persuasion. On Saturday morning, David made a decision. He would directly confront Eliza about what he had discovered. Not in an accusatory way, but as someone who cared about her and wanted to understand the truth. If there was an innocent explanation for all this, he wanted to hear it. And if there wasn't, he needed to know what situation he was getting himself into. He found Eliza in the hospital break room during the mid-morning pause. She was alone, drinking tea and reading a poetry book she had brought from home. There was something deeply serene in the scene, a tranquility that dramatically contrasted with the turbulence David felt inside. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. "Of course," she replied, closing the book and smiling at him. But David noticed that the smile faltered slightly when she saw the serious expression on his face. "It's about your past in Chicago," he said directly, deciding that beating around the bush would be a dangerous waste of time. The change in Eliza's expression was instant and dramatic. All color drained from her face, and she held the teacup so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "What about my past?" she asked, but her voice had become careful, controlled. "About Mark Anderson, about the corruption scheme, about why you changed your name and came to hide here." For a long moment, Eliza said nothing. She just looked at him with an expression that mixed fear, sadness, and something that seemed very much like relief. "How did you find out?" she finally asked. "Someone is sending me information. A private investigator who's looking for your ex-husband." Eliza closed her eyes and breathed deeply, as if preparing to dive into deep and dangerous waters. "Robert Carter," she said, and it wasn't a question. "You know him?" "I know him. He's been following me for 2 years, showing up in every town I move to, asking the same questions, making the same veiled threats." "What kind of threats?" Eliza opened her eyes and looked directly at David. There was a vulnerability in that look that made him want to protect her, even not knowing completely from what. "Threats that if I don't reveal where Mark is hiding, he'll make sure I'm formally charged as an accomplice. Threats that he'll destroy any chance I have of rebuilding my life." "And do you know where Mark is?" Another long pause. Eliza seemed to be carefully weighing how much of the truth she could share. "I do," she finally admitted. The confession hit David like a bucket of cold water. A part of him had hoped she would deny any knowledge, that she would prove her innocence. But at the same time, there was something honest in the admission that made him respect her courage in telling the truth. "Why don't you tell them where he is?" asked David. "If you didn't do anything wrong, why protect someone who put you in this situation?" Eliza laughed, but it was a bitter laugh without humor. "Because it's not that simple. Mark has documents that could implicate people who helped me when everything fell apart. People who risked their own careers to get me out of Chicago and give me a chance to start over. If I turn in Mark, they will also be destroyed." "What kind of people?" "Doctors from the hospital where I worked. Decent people who realized I was being used as a scapegoat and decided to help me. They falsified documents to give me a new identity, arranged the transfer to Pine Ridge, gave me a chance to have a normal life away from all that." The story was becoming more complex with each revelation. It wasn't a simple matter of guilt or innocence, but a complicated network of loyalties, favors, and unintended consequences. "And the envelope you always carry?" asked David. Eliza hesitated, but then opened her purse and took out the sealed envelope he had seen so many times. "They're copies of documents that Mark left me before disappearing. Documents that prove my innocence. But that also implicate the people who helped me. It's my insurance policy and my curse at the same time." David looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb that could explode at any moment. "Can I ask why you're telling me this? Why trust me?" Eliza smiled, and this time there was true tenderness in the expression. "Because in the last 3 years, since all this began, you're the first person who made me feel like I could have a normal life again. Because when I'm with you, I can temporarily forget that I'm a fugitive, and because I fell in love with you." The confession took David completely by surprise. They had danced around their feelings for weeks, but neither had verbalized what was happening between them. "Eliza, I know it's complicated," she continued quickly. "I know my situation makes any relationship impossible. That's why I've been trying to keep my distance, even when all I want is to be close to you." David stood up from the chair and approached her. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many contradictory emotions fighting inside him. Fear, attraction, protection, uncertainty, love. "Eliza," he said, putting his hands on her face, "I don't care about your past. I don't care about Mark or Carter or any of these documents. I care about you, about the woman you are now." "But you should care," she said, covering his hands with hers, "because associating with me can destroy everything you've built here. Carter won't stop. He'll keep pressing, and eventually this will become public. Your reputation, your career, your tranquility, all of that is at risk." "Let me worry about that," said David, and kissed her softly. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes. "What are we going to do?" asked Eliza. "I don't know," admitted David, "but we'll figure it out together." What they didn't know was that Robert Carter had photographed the kiss through the break room window, and that photograph would be only the first of many moves he would make to force Eliza to reveal where Mark Anderson was hiding. The war that had begun with anonymous notes was about to escalate into something much more dangerous, and David, whether he wanted to or not, was now an integral part of that battle. The revelation of the truth about Eliza's past, instead of pushing David away, created an even deeper and more dangerous intimacy between them. It was as if, finally free from the weight of secrets, they could give themselves completely to what they felt for each other, even knowing that this surrender made them even more vulnerable. In the 5 days following the conversation in the hospital break room, they met every night. Not at the hospital, where Carter's eyes might be watching, but in places carefully chosen by Eliza, places where she had learned over 2 years of running to detect if she was being followed. The first meeting was in a small abandoned chapel 15 miles from Pine Ridge, on top of a hill covered with eucalyptus trees, where the wind created a melancholy symphony among the leaves. David arrived first, parking the car on a dirt road that seemed not to have been used for months. When Eliza appeared, driving a rental car he had never seen before, David realized he was facing a version of her he had never imagined. This was Eliza in survival mode. Alert, strategic, always checking the rearview mirrors, always leaving the engine running for a quick escape. There was something simultaneously impressive and frightening in the competence with which she navigated the necessary paranoia of her situation. "I learned to be careful," she explained, when she noticed his concerned expression. 2 years on the run teach you to never underestimate how far certain people are willing to go." They walked in silence to the chapel, a colonial ruin with stone walls covered in ivy and windows without glass that framed the mountainous landscape. The interior smelled of old wood and rancid incense, but there was an almost sacred peace in that space forgotten by time. "This is where I come when I need to think," said Eliza, sitting on a worm-eaten wooden bench that had resisted the decades of abandonment. "It's one of the few places where I feel truly safe." David sat beside her, and for the first time since they had met, they stayed in total silence for several minutes. Not the awkward silence of two people who don't know what to say, but the comfortable silence of those who can finally let their guard down. It was Eliza who broke the silence, not with words, but by moving closer to him on the bench and resting her head on his shoulder. The gesture was simple but carried the weight of an absolute trust that she hadn't placed in anyone for years. "David," she said softly, "I need you to understand that what we're doing is dangerous not just for me but for you too. Carter won't hesitate to use you to get to me." "I've thought about that," he replied, putting his arm around her. and I decided I don't care. But I care, she said, raising her head to look him in the eyes. I can't be responsible for destroying your life too. You're not destroying anything, said David firmly. You're giving me back something I thought I had lost forever. What? The ability to feel that it's worth being alive. The kiss that followed was different from the first one in the elevator. There was no more hesitation, no more unanswered questions about what they were doing. It was a kiss from two people who had decided to face together any consequence that might come. When they separated, Eliza took the envelope from her purse and handed it to him. I want you to read it, she said. I want you to know exactly what you're getting involved with. David took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. For weeks, that object had represented the central mystery of Eliza's personality. Now he was about to discover if the truth it contained was something he could accept. The documents inside the envelope told a complex story of manipulation, naivety, and survival. There were copies of emails between Mark and suppliers, spreadsheets showing the diverted values, records of bank accounts in false names. But there was also a handwritten letter from Mark to Eliza, dated a few days before his disappearance. The letter revealed a desperate man who had become involved in a corruption network much larger than he had initially imagined. Mark had started by accepting small favors, expensive dinners, discreet gifts, from suppliers who wanted to secure contracts. But gradually the favors became direct bribes, and the bribes became participation in elaborate overcharging schemes. What made everything even more complicated was that Mark had discovered that his direct superiors not only knew about the scheme, but were the true coordinators. He had become a pawn in a much larger operation, and when the investigations began, he was chosen as the scapegoat. Eliza, the letter said, I know you always suspected how we managed to buy the house, take the trips, live beyond our means. Now you know the truth, and I know you must hate me for bringing this into our life. But I need you to understand that when I realized how deep I had gotten, it was already too late to get out without serious consequences for both of us. The documents I'm leaving with you are my insurance policy and my curse. They prove that you never knew anything, never consciously participated in anything illegal, but they also show the involvement of very powerful people who will do anything to keep their secrets protected. If something happens to me, if I'm found dead or permanently disappear, you must decide what to do with this information. You can turn it over to the authorities and trust that justice will be done, even knowing that this may put your own life at risk. Or you can use this information to negotiate your own safety. But whatever choice you make, remember that I loved you truly, even being too cowardly to adequately protect you from the consequences of my actions. David finished reading the letter with a lump in his throat. The moral complexity of Eliza's situation was far beyond what he had imagined. She wasn't simply an innocent wife who had been dragged into her husband's problems. She was being forced to choose between justice and survival, between doing the right thing and protecting the people who had helped her. Now you understand, said Eliza, when he finished reading, why I can't simply turn everything over to the police, why I can't reveal where Mark is hiding, and why I can't allow you to become more deeply involved in this. Actually, said David, carefully refolding the documents, now I understand why I need to become more deeply involved. You can't face this alone. David? No, he gently interrupted. You've spent 2 years running, hiding, living in fear. That's not life, Eliza, it's just survival. And you deserve more than that. And what do you suggest we do? That we directly confront Carter, that we challenge people who have resources and connections that we can't even imagine? I suggest we stop running and start fighting, said David. I suggest we find a way to use these documents, not just to protect you, but to expose the whole truth. Eliza laughed, but there were tears in her eyes. You don't understand what we're fighting against. These people have money, influence, lawyers. They can make witnesses disappear, evidence get lost, cases get archived. Maybe, said David. But they also have a lot to lose if the truth comes out. And sometimes when people have a lot to lose, they make mistakes. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the chapel, planning how they could transform Eliza's defensive situation into an offensive position. It wasn't a perfect plan. There were many variables they couldn't control. But for the first time in 2 years, Eliza began to believe that perhaps there was a way out that didn't involve running forever. In the following days, They met in different locations each night, always chosen by Eliza, always carefully checked to ensure they weren't being observed. One night it was on an isolated trail that led to a hidden waterfall. Another was at an abandoned lookout where they used to install radio antennas decades earlier. During these meetings, they not only discussed strategies for dealing with Carter and Eliza's legal situation, they also got to know each other in ways that went far beyond the dramatic circumstances that had united them. David discovered that Eliza had studied literature at university before deciding to pursue nursing, hence her sophisticated knowledge of classic authors. She had switched courses in her third year because she wanted to do something that had a direct impact on people's lives, not just study about life indirectly through books. Eliza discovered that David had been a brilliant surgeon in Chicago, not only because of technical competence, but because he possessed a natural empathy that made him genuinely connect with his patients' suffering. It was this empathy that had made Claire's death so devastating. He hadn't just lost a wife, but his ability to trust his own instincts about the people he loved. "It's ironic," said Eliza one night when they were sitting on a wooden bridge over a stream that ran between moss-covered rocks. "We both came to Pine Ridge, running from versions of ourselves that we couldn't bear. You running from guilt, me running from association with crimes I didn't commit. And now we've found in each other a way to go back to being who we really are. Maybe that's why we work so well together," said David. "We recognize each other's pain because it's familiar. Or maybe we work well because we see in each other the possibility of healing," she replied, intertwining her fingers with his. The physical intimacy between them had grown naturally throughout these meetings, not just kisses but caresses, the need to be close, to confirm through touch that the emotional connection they felt was real and reciprocal. There was an urgency in this intimacy, as if both instinctively knew that the time they had together was limited and precious. It was on a Thursday night, when they were at their fourth meeting in an abandoned fisherman's cabin on the shores of an artificial lake, that Carter finally showed his cards. David arrived first, as always. The cabin was dark and silent, with only the sound of water gently lapping against the stones of the shore. He lit some candles that Eliza had brought the night before, creating soft and romantic lighting that contrasted with the rusticity of the environment. When Eliza arrived, she seemed more tense than usual. She checked twice if the door was locked, tested all the windows, and only then allowed herself to relax slightly. "Is something wrong?" asked David. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I've had a strange feeling today, as if I'm being watched more closely than usual. Maybe we should cancel tonight." "No," said Eliza firmly. "I won't let paranoia control my life more than it already does. Besides, there's something I need to tell you." She approached him and put her hands on his chest, looking directly into his eyes. "I love you," she said simply, completely, irrevocably. "And I want you to know that in case something happens." "Nothing is going to happen," said David, but there was a disturbing premonition in the way she had made that declaration. "And I love you too." They kissed with an intensity that spoke of farewell as much as passion, and it was during this kiss that they heard the sound of an engine approaching the cabin. Eliza pulled away instantly, her survival reflexes taking control. She quickly extinguished the candles and moved to the window, carefully peering through the improvised curtains. "It's him," she whispered. "Carter. And he's not alone." David approached the window and saw two men getting out of a black SUV. He immediately recognized Carter. The other was younger, more muscular, and moved with the precision of someone trained for conflictive physical situations. "Is there a back exit?" asked David. "Yes, but it leads directly to the lake. We would have to swim, and they could see us. Then we stay and face them." "David, no. You don't understand the kind of people we're dealing with." But before they could decide on a course of action, Carter's voice echoed from outside the cabin. "Eliza, I know you're in there, and I know you brought company. Why don't you come out so we can talk like civilized adults?" Eliza and David looked at each other. There was no way to pretend they weren't there. "What do you want, Carter?" shouted Eliza through the door. "The same thing I've always wanted, information about your ex-husband, but now I have something that can make our negotiation more productive." Carter made a dramatic pause before continuing. "I have very interesting photographs of you two, kissing in the hospital break room, walking hand in hand on isolated trails." entering this cabin together. Photographs that could be very embarrassing if they were published in the local newspaper, or sent to the medical board, or to the hospital board. David felt his stomach sink. They had been so careful, but apparently not careful enough. Additionally, continued Carter, I have information about Dr. Mitchell's past that could be equally embarrassing. About the real circumstances of his wife's death, about why he really left Chicago, information that some people might interpret as medical negligence or worse. Now it was David who felt cornered. How had Carter gotten information about Claire? And what distorted version of the facts was he prepared to disseminate? What do you want in exchange? Asked Eliza. Come out of the cabin. Let's talk properly. Eliza looked at David and he nodded. There was no choice. They opened the door and stepped out into the moonlight, where Carter was waiting for them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Much better, said the investigator. Now we can have a frank conversation about mutual expectations. The younger man had strategically positioned himself to block any escape route, confirming David's suspicions about his function. Eliza, said Carter, my patience is running out. For 2 years I've been playing this cat-and-mouse game with you, and it's time to end it. You have information my client needs. You can deliver it voluntarily and continue your little romantic life here in the mountains, or you can continue being stubborn and see both your reputations publicly destroyed. What guarantee do I have that if I tell you what you want to know, you'll leave me in peace? Asked Eliza. None, said Carter honestly. But you have my word that if you don't tell me, I'll make it impossible for you two to live peacefully anywhere. David stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Eliza. And if we refuse to negotiate with you? Carter laughed. Doctor, you're an intelligent man. You must realize that you're not in a position to refuse anything. You have a reputation to protect, a career to maintain, and now you have a girlfriend with a very colorful past. The math is simple. The math, said David slowly, also includes the fact that blackmail is a crime, and that intimidation is a crime, and that harassment is a crime. Prove it, said Carter. Prove that we're not just old friends having a friendly conversation on a beautiful night. The impasse stretched for several tense minutes. Carter clearly expected the pressure to force an immediate capitulation, but both David and Eliza remained silent. Finally, it was Eliza who spoke. I need time to think. How much time? A week. Carter shook his head. 2 days. And Eliza, just to make clear what's at stake, I'll leave a small sample of the material I have on you two. He took an envelope from his pocket and held it out to her. Eliza took it with hands that trembled slightly. Open it when you get home, said Carter. And remember, 2 days. The two men returned to the SUV and disappeared into the darkness, leaving David and Eliza alone with the envelope and the certainty that their situation had become critical. They drove back to town in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what that meeting meant for their future. When they arrived at Eliza's apartment, the first time David had been there, she opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were 3 photographs. The first showed them kissing in the hospital break room. The second showed them walking hand in hand on a trail. The third was a photo of David entering the fisherman's cabin, followed a few minutes later by Eliza. But there was also a 4th item in the envelope, a copy of a newspaper report about Claire's death, with certain phrases highlighted in yellow, phrases that suggested that David could have prevented the accident if he had taken different actions. They researched you too, said Eliza quietly. They're prepared to destroy your life if necessary. David looked at the photographs and felt a mixture of anger and determination. I won't let them intimidate us, he said. David, you don't understand. These people don't make empty threats. If I don't tell them where Mark is, they'll fulfill their promises. And if you do tell, Eliza remained silent for a long moment. If I tell, Mark will probably be killed, and the people who helped me will be arrested or professionally destroyed. I would save my own skin at the expense of everyone who helped me. Then there's a third option, said David. Which? We run. We leave Pine Ridge, go somewhere Carter can't find us, start over. Eliza smiled sadly. David, I've already tried running. For 2 years. They always find me, and now that you're involved, they have even more ways to track us. David pulled her into his arms, feeling the weight of the impossible situation they were in. So what do we do? "I do what I should have done from the beginning," said Eliza, and there was a new resolution in her voice. "I take control of the situation." What does that mean? It means I stop being the victim and start being the protagonist of my own story. But when David woke up the next morning, Eliza had disappeared. The apartment was empty, clean, as if no one had lived there. Her clothes were gone, her books were no longer on the shelves, even her toothbrush was no longer in the bathroom. The only thing she had left behind was a handwritten letter on the kitchen table, along with the envelope containing the documents that could destroy or save so many lives. "My love," the letter began, "I know that when you read this, you'll be angry with me for leaving without saying a proper goodbye. But you need to understand that this is the only way to protect you, and at the same time do what is right. I've decided that I can no longer live running, but I also can't live knowing that other people are paying the price for my cowardice. I'm going to confront Carter and his clients directly, but I'm going to do it on my own terms. The documents I left with you are your insurance policy. If something happens to me, if I disappear or am found dead, you must decide what to do with them. You can turn them over to the proper authorities and trust that justice will be done, or you can use the information to negotiate your own protection. But whatever choice you make, remember that you gave me back the courage to fight. Remember that in the few days we had together, I was happier than in the last 5 years combined. If I disappear, don't look for me, but if you still trust me, open the envelope." David finished reading the letter with trembling hands. He looked at the sealed envelope on the table, knowing that the decision he would make in the next few minutes would determine not only his own future, but possibly the fate of several other people. Outside, it began to snow, the first snowfall in Pine Ridge in 3 years. The entire town was immersing in white, as if the world was being erased and rewritten. David held the envelope between his fingers, knowing that the past was about to be rewritten, and that nothing, neither he nor Eliza nor what still remained of the two, would be the same after opening that seal. David sat at Eliza's kitchen table for almost an hour, looking at the sealed envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. The snow continued to fall outside, covering Pine Ridge with a white mantle that made the town unrecognizable. It was as if the entire world was being remade, and he was being forced to make the decision that would determine which version of this new world he would inhabit. At 9 in the morning, he gathered courage and tore the seal. Inside the envelope, besides the documents he already knew, there was something that Eliza had never shown before, a flash drive, and an additional letter that was glued to the inside of the envelope, written in tiny, rushed handwriting that he could barely decipher. "If you're reading this," the secret letter said, "it means the situation has become unsustainable, and I had to leave to protect you. The flash drive contains recordings I secretly made over the last 2 years, conversations with Carter, phone calls from people he represents, even a recording of the meeting at the fisherman's cabin that I managed to make with my hidden phone. David, I'm not the defenseless victim I appear to be. In the last 2 years, while pretending to be running, I was actually collecting evidence. Each town I moved to, each job I got, each appearance by Carter, were opportunities to document the corruption network that goes far beyond Mark's original case. I discovered that my ex-husband wasn't an independent criminal, but a small piece in an organization that diverts public funds from hospitals across the country, and that Robert Carter doesn't work for the authorities, but for the true heads of the scheme, who want to eliminate any evidence that might implicate them." David stopped reading, feeling a mixture of admiration and terror. Eliza had been much braver and more strategic than he had imagined, but she had also put herself in mortal danger. "If something happens to me," the letter continued, "you should take both the documents and the flash drive to Federal Prosecutor Marcus Reynolds in Denver. He is one of the few people in the judicial system who can't be bought, and I've already been in indirect contact with him through intermediaries. But if I manage to execute my plan, if I manage to force a confrontation where they are obligated to reveal their true intentions, then the recordings on the flash drive will be enough to completely destroy them. My love, I know you're furious with me for leaving without explanations, but I needed to protect you from what's about to happen, and I needed to make sure that, if my plan goes wrong, there would be someone I trust to finish what I started." The letter ended with detailed instructions on how to contact the federal prosecutor and a series of codes that Eliza had developed for secure communication in case she needed to contact David in the coming days. David connected the flash drive to Eliza's laptop and spent the next 2 hours listening to recordings that revealed the astonishing extent of the corruption she had uncovered. It wasn't just hospitals in Chicago, but a national network that included politicians, businessmen, and even members of the judiciary. The most recent recordings were particularly revealing. In one of them, Carter was talking on the phone with someone who was clearly his superior, discussing permanent elimination of persistent problems, language that left no doubt about their true intentions. "The nurse is becoming more trouble than she's worth," Carter was saying in the recording, "and now there's a doctor involved who can complicate things. Maybe it's time to solve both problems at once." "Do what's necessary," replied the voice on the other end, "but make sure there are no trails leading back to us." David turned off the laptop with trembling hands. Eliza wasn't just running or hiding. She was actively hunting people who wanted to kill her, using herself as bait in an operation that could cost her life. And he had no idea where she was. He spent the rest of the morning trying to decipher the clues she had left in the letter. There were references to locations in Pine Ridge that they had visited together, but also mentions of nearby towns where she had lived before. It was as if she was following a planned script, but there was no way to know where that script would end. It was only when he was rereading the letter for the 5th time that he noticed something that had gone unnoticed. One of the phrases was written with slightly different ink, as if it had been added later. "The theater where we first saw each other holds secrets that haven't yet been performed." The Municipal Theater, the location of the charity gala where everything had begun between them. David put on his coat and drove through the snow to the historic center, parking in the same spot he had used on the night of the gala. The theater was closed, apparently empty, but there were recent footprints in the snow that led to the side entrance of the building. The door was unlocked. David entered the theater silently, using his cell phone flashlight to navigate the dark corridors. The building was cold and silent, but there was something in the quality of the silence that suggested it wasn't completely empty. He reached the main auditorium and stopped at the entrance, observing the stage where the musical presentation that he and Eliza had watched together had taken place. The seats were empty, but there were 3 figures on the stage: Eliza, Carter, and the younger man who had been with him at the fisherman's cabin. Eliza was sitting in a chair in the center of the stage, apparently calm, but David could see that her hands were tied behind her back. Carter was pacing back and forth in front of her, clearly agitated, gesturing while speaking in a voice too low for David to hear from the entrance. David considered calling the police, but remembered the recordings he had heard. The corruption network included local authorities, and there was no guarantee that a call to the police wouldn't alert the wrong people. Instead, he took out his own cell phone and started recording, moving silently through the auditorium to get close enough to capture audio. When he reached the 5th row, coincidentally, where he had sat with Eliza on the night of the gala, he could hear the conversation on the stage. "2 years of cat and mouse, Eliza," Carter was saying. "2 years making a fool out of me while you collected evidence like some kind of amateur detective. Did you really think we wouldn't find out?" "You found out too late," replied Eliza, and there was a confidence in her voice that surprised David. "The evidence has already been delivered. If anything happens to me, you'll be automatically exposed." Carter laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Bluff. If you had delivered anything to the authorities, we would have already been contacted." "Who said I delivered it to the local authorities?" The question made Carter stop pacing. "What do you mean?" "Federal Prosecutor Marcus Reynolds," said Eliza calmly. "Special operation of the Federal Public Ministry. Investigation that includes state and municipal authorities. You have no idea of the size of the network being investigated, nor how much has already been discovered." The younger man whispered something to Carter, who became visibly paler. "You're lying," said Carter, but there was less conviction in his voice. "Am I lying about having left documents and recordings in 3 different locations, with instructions for them to be automatically delivered if I don't make regular contact? Am I lying about having names, dates, values, and bank accounts? Am I lying about having recordings of you discussing permanent elimination of witnesses?" Now it was Carter who seemed to be being interrogated. "How did you manage to record our conversations, manage to track the communications between you and your bosses? Robert, did you really think a nurse who survived 2 years being hunted by professionals would be naive enough not to learn to protect herself. David began to understand Eliza's plan. She hadn't disappeared to hide or to surrender. She had disappeared to force a complete confession, to make Carter reveal information she didn't yet have. And it was working. "What do you want?" Carter finally asked. "I want you to call your bosses," said Eliza. "I want you to explain the situation to them. And I want all of you to decide if it's worth escalating this to homicide when you're already being federally investigated. And if they decide it's worth it, then you'll be held responsible not just for corruption, but for murder. And I guarantee there's enough hidden evidence to destroy the entire network, even if I disappear." Carter took his cell phone from his pocket and dialed a number. The conversation that followed was conducted in a low voice, but David managed to capture enough to understand that a decision was being made about Eliza's fate. And by the expression on Carter's face when he hung up, the decision hadn't been favorable to her. "I'm sorry, Eliza," said Carter, and there was something that seemed genuinely sad in his voice. "They decided you know too much to stay alive, and that the doctor has also become a problem that needs to be solved." "David doesn't know anything," Eliza quickly lied. "He has no involvement in this. He knows enough, and besides, it will be easier to explain if you two disappear together. Tragic romance, couple who fled town, never seen again." Carter made a sign to the younger man, who began to approach Eliza with something in his hand that looked like a syringe. It was at that moment that David decided he had waited long enough. "Actually," he said, standing up from the fifth row and walking toward the stage, "I know much more than you imagine." The three on the stage turned in his direction, and David saw the instant relief in Eliza's eyes, immediately followed by terror when she realized he had put himself in danger. "Dr. Mitchell," said Carter, quickly regaining his composure. "How convenient. Saves the trouble of looking for you." "Perhaps," said David, continuing to walk toward the stage while keeping his cell phone discreetly positioned to continue recording. "But before we do anything irreversible, there are some things you should know." "Like what?" "Like the fact that the FBI is already on their way to Pine Ridge. Like the fact that Prosecutor Marcus Reynolds has issued arrest warrants for you and 12 other people involved in this scheme. And like the fact that I spent the entire morning sending copies of all the evidence Eliza collected to journalists in Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C. Carter laughed, but there was nervousness in the laugh. "You're bluffing. You didn't have time to—" "I had 3 hours," interrupted David. 3 hours to listen to very interesting recordings of your conversations. 3 hours to discover names and bank accounts. 3 hours to understand that this scheme goes far beyond hospital corruption." David climbed the side steps to the stage, maintaining a safe distance from Carter and his assistant, but positioning himself so as to be between them and Eliza. "The question now," continued David, "is whether you want to be arrested for corruption and blackmail, or if you want to add kidnapping and homicide to the charges." "You're bluffing," repeated Carter, but with less conviction. "Am I?" David took the cell phone from his pocket and showed the screen. "I've been recording this entire conversation, including the part where you admitted your bosses decided to kill us, including the part where you confirmed there's a corruption network involving federal authorities." Carter's assistant urgently whispered something in his ear. Carter became visibly paler. "Besides," said David, "do you really think Eliza would come here alone without having a backup plan? Do you think I would come here without having left clear instructions about what to do if I didn't return home?" In fact, David hadn't left instructions for anyone, but he had learned from Eliza that convincing bluffs could be as effective as elaborate plans. Carter and his assistant exchanged nervous glances. It was obvious they hadn't anticipated this level of preparation. "So what do you suggest?" Carter finally asked. "I suggest you release Eliza immediately," said David. "I suggest you leave Pine Ridge while you still can, and I suggest you hire very good lawyers, because regardless of what happens here today, you're going to need them." For a moment that seemed like an eternity. No one moved. The theater was in complete silence, with only the sound of the heavy breathing of the 5 people on the stage. Then Carter made a gesture to his assistant, who reluctantly put away the syringe and moved away from Eliza. "Untie her," ordered Carter. The younger man untied the ropes that bound Eliza's hands, who immediately stood up and walked to stand beside David. "This doesn't end here," said Carter, as he and the assistant headed for the side exit of the stage. "You have no idea who you're fighting against." "Actually," said Eliza calmly, We have exactly the idea of who we're fighting against. And that's why we're going to win." Carter stopped at the exit and turned to look at them one last time. "You destroyed many lives today," he said. "No," replied Eliza. "We saved many lives today. The lives of patients who will receive the treatment they deserve when the money stops being diverted. The lives of honest people who work in the healthcare system. And our own lives." Carter left without responding, and a few minutes later they heard the sound of a car leaving the theater parking lot. David and Eliza remained alone.